If you're interested in exploring these topics further, learning and connecting with like-minded individuals, check out the 3 Patreon discussion groups available. Just visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com and click the participate button. I also offer a free meditation group online every Sunday evening at 8 p.m. Eastern. Just go to any of my social media profiles for the link found in my link tree. There's no pressure to be on camera or to actively participate in any of these groups. Just come and listen and enjoy. Join an online spiritual community of everyday people committed to understanding the human experience more deeply through spiritual practices that we can apply to our everyday lives. Join us. Welcome to the Infinite Spark of Being podcast. My name is Keith Welsh, and today we're getting into something that I'm pretty sure most of you have never heard of. Now, if you've been on the journey with the rest of us, trekking up this mountain, you've probably noticed a few changes in your life. You've noticed positive changes in the way you experience yourself and thus the world around you. But then there's this other stuff, side effects, things like increased levels of boredom with your old friend group, an inability to relate to popular culture. In fact, others around you may experience time delays. And this is a side effect that may cause a disorientation or hallucination in others, where time seems to have slowed down for them to the point where they can only perceive a version of you from 10 years ago. Another side effect for you would be a loss of interest in things that you were once mindlessly engaged in. And finally, an urge to consume literature that may result in internal screaming at family gatherings, parties, and barbecues. Well, that's all about to get much worse, because today we're looking at the Oversoul, the Soul, and the Daemon. We'll be breaking down Rudolph Steiner's teachings on the hierarchy of the soul, Edgar Cayce's take on the higher self, and the Greek concept of the Daemon, which, by the way, is not a demon, but something far more interesting. And of course, we'll look at how Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity define the soul and compare their views to Steiner's and Cayce's insights. Now, this is one of those episodes that I truly hope alienates you and makes you as withdrawn as it's made me. Seriously, though, I was doing a one-on-one session with someone the other night, and she was laughingly lamenting that she can't just go to a sports bar, sit at a table, and be entertained by the conversation anymore. This is a very common side effect of living a more spiritually focused life. So I want to say this to you guys. Yes, you are going to feel frustrated and alone at times because, as we say, the edge is a lonely place. You'll long for the days where you didn't know what you now know. In fact, you may even try to abandon this path and attempt to go back out into the world as if nothing happened. But what you'll find is that you can't unlearn what you know. You can't untaste what you've tasted, and you can't pretend that the basic cable material existence is enough. And when it comes to spending time with those other people, something will shift. You'll almost get more engaged with those conversations. The best way I can explain it to you is this. You know when a child is telling you about their game, their toys, and they tell you the toy goes here and the thing does this, they're showing you how it works, who's a good guy, who's a bad guy, and they're going on, but you don't get mad or annoyed. You actually smile and entertain it. You ask follow-up questions. You make little jokes. You don't throw the toy and tell them it's not real, it's all fake, and none of it matters. You don't do that. Your heart opens and you play along. That's where you'll land on this, I promise. So let's get into it. All right. Let's start with the big question. What are we really? Because if you've been following this work for a while, you already know that we are not just these meat suits walking around, bumping into stimuli and having reactions. There's something deeper, something that seems connected to a much larger reality. So this is going to conflict with all of our non-duality ideas about what we are. So we're going to have to put that aside for a little bit while we go through this material. But this idea that we exist in layers isn't new. though they eventually circle back to a non-dualist point of view. Most ancient traditions, esoteric teachings, occult paths, most spiritual and religious traditions describe the human experience as something far beyond just one singular self. And though this is a common point of view, it's very difficult to understand a lot of it. However, there are two modern day thinkers that do a really good job of that, and that's Rudolph Steiner and Edgar Cayce. Now, a lot of you are unaware of these guys, or maybe you've heard of Cayce as some kind of a fortune teller, but the reality is that they changed our culture in ways that most people will never understand. I mean, if you've ever taken an interest in spirituality in the West, then you've reaped the benefits of their lives, honestly. So this is part of an ongoing attempt to expose you guys to people that maybe you've never heard of. In past episodes, I've mentioned Alice Bailey, Helena Blavatsky, Jack Parsons, and now Rudolph Steiner and Edgar Cayce. These are answers to those of you that don't believe that there is a spiritual tradition in the West, because there is. However, most of it has been demonized by the Christian faction in our society as satanic, which couldn't be further from the truth. There is so much more out there than the 5 big religions. In fact, you could argue that consciousness is evolving, and therefore our ability to understand God is evolving. That being the case, the methods we use to understand and get close to God evolve as well. Think about it. You don't go to a doctor or a surgeon and demand they use tools and medicine from the 1600s. No, you ask for the latest shit. We as spiritual beings are evolving, and so is our collective unconscious. Culturally, our minds now are perceiving things very differently than they used to. This isn't meant to dismiss tradition, obviously, but we have to be able to once again let go of the side of the pool, lose sight of land, exile ourselves to the forest, wander in the desert, move out of our parents' house, and make a life of our own. We have to explore our relationship with the divine. So let's start with Rudolph Steiner. Steiner wasn't just some casual philosopher. He was an architect, a mystic, a literary critic. He was a social reformer. In fact, at one point, he wrote a book called The Philosophy of Freedom, which is interesting considering he was one of the most vocal critics of this wave of nationalism that was making its way through parts of Europe. The same wave later brought Hitler to power. Why is that interesting? Because some people place him and Blavatsky in the same bucket as Western esotericists who were somehow racist or satanic based on the fact that some Germans got a bunch of shit backwards, literally backwards. This goes to show you that not asking follow-up questions or not doing a little research and simply taking things at face value because it supports your frustration, anger, isn't a new phenomenon. And finally, he was a scientist of the unseen. Now, I know there are some of you out there that find it irritating when someone like me refers to a mystic as being a scientist. And to that, I would say go listen to episode 190 on Jack Parsons. Once you've completed it, go take a look at the rituals and ceremonies around rocket launches, what they name the missions, etc. My point is, mysticism and science sleep together all the time. So, anyway, he was born in 1861 in a part of Hungary that is now known as Croatia. But the thing that I think is fascinating about Steiner, like a lot of these characters, is that he had a mind that could bridge the gap between science and spirituality, which is fucking rare for someone trained in Western philosophy and academia. I mean, Christ, these boring white bread, wet blanket bores like Sam Harris and Neil deGrasse Tyson, and my favorite self-congratulating masturbatory backpatter Richard Dawkins can't let go of the side of the fucking pool long enough to have a little fun. It's fucking dorks. Explore, like, be skeptical, but don't be a fucking cynic over there with your arms folded, pouting in the corner like the fucking lazy atheist you are. Have a little fun. Okay, so what made Rudolph Steiner different? Well, he didn't just theorize about spirituality, he claimed to actually perceive it. Steiner had what you'd call clairvoyant experiences from a pretty young age, And he spent his entire life refining these insights, and he turned it into a structured spiritual science, which he called anthroposophy. Anthroposophy. Now, anyway, I'm sure I just ruined the case I was attempting to make for his credibility, but hear me out. I got nothing that... Here's the problem. The second someone claims clairvoyance, we kind of tighten up, which is why this is going to be a rough episode, because both of our subjects were clairvoyant. So look, sometimes we encounter these people with unbelievable stories along this path, and it can be off-putting depending on how far we've come to the edge ourselves. I mean, I myself have had enough anomalous encounters to where I fall somewhere between skepticism bordering on cynicism and belief. Look, I never want to be cynical, but I have that tendency. It's part of my personality. But when I do find myself thinking that way, I remind myself of my own unbelievable experiences and just think, well, shit, it might be real. In fact, my cynicism can be so strong that I actually forget my own experiences and then feel a slight internal embarrassment when I remember, hey, dummy, you're a weirdo too. So without attempting to make a case for clairvoyance and in turn derailing this entire episode, I'll say this. When we're on this path and we encounter anomalous or truly remarkable people, situations, whatever, we automatically run it through our filters, of course. Now, what I've noticed is this. Sometimes I really want to believe, right? And that's a red flag. Why? Because I never want my own desire for something to be true to cloud my judgment. And wanting something to be true will actually keep me from capital T truth. Now, other times I do not want to believe, again, red flag. Why? Because resistance will also keep you from capital T truth. We see both of these scenarios in a lot of places in our lives, right? Politics, religion, relationships. So yeah, we always want to be skeptical, not just of what is being said to us, but maybe more so what we are saying to ourselves about what is being said to us, if that makes sense. Now, there's other times where I might have some healthy skepticism, and remember, if we're looking for truth, then we need to have a little. But there is also an ease around it, or to sound a bit woo-woo, vibrationally, it's in sync. So really, it all needs to be held loosely in our minds. We never really want to cling too tightly to these things, because what we start to notice is the more we engage with meditative practice, not only are we learning to watch our thoughts as a spectator, but we feel into things better. Our discernment gets sharper and our intuition kind of wakes up. Now, as I said before, sometimes our intuition and our thoughts don't align, and that can be difficult. That's where holding it all loosely kind of comes in. So with Steiner, I've run the gambit. There was a time where I would roll my eyes anytime he came up, but over the years, after meeting some truly remarkable teachers, having more and more anomalous experiences of my own, I've eased up around him. In fact, the more I've learned, the more I see where he might be right. And I'd also like to say this. The first Buddhist Dharma talk I went to was a Sunday satsang where Lama Losan was teaching. I sat in the back of the room with my arms folded on a couch thinking, this is so dark and weird. So I went home and my wife at the time asked me, how was it? I said, it was dumb. She asked if I'd go back, and I distinctly remember feeling a little charge in my body, and I said, yeah, probably. So what's that? I have no idea, but here we are years and years and years later. In fact, I remember telling that to Lama Losan once, and he laughed and just said, the Dharma works. Honestly, I think it was the situation I mentioned a bit ago where your mind and your intuition are in conflict. And thank God I went with my intuition. So before we get into Rudolph Steiner's Hierarchy of the Self, I'll recommend one of his books, and that's Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. First off, I'll say it's a tough read. It's kind of like Autobiography of a Yogi, that kind of like flowery language. later on, in fact, I got it on Audible, and it's even a tough listen, but it's a very important book. You should really find a way to put it into your stored subconscious. But what it is his system for waking up. It's his way of teaching people to engage those senses that really lie dormant in most humans. It talks about moral character as a way of preparing ourselves to receive higher information, which I find really cool. He gets into quieting the mind through concentration exercises. And they're kind of, well, they are very occult methods of visualization. One that I like is, you look at a plant and a crystal. In fact, I think it's called The Plant and the Crystal, and you contemplate their differences, right? That could mean just being present to the differences, feeling those differences, right? You notice the plant is always moving, it's growing, it's alive, but the crystal doesn't, right? You notice the rigidity of the crystal. Then you engage in a meditation exercise that is meant to give us a practice of perceiving this etheric field that we'll talk more about in a minute, but that's one of the exercises. Either way, his practices are pretty focused and intense. The plant and the crystal is a practice that I quite like. I mean, you can do with anything, right? Like you can pick something that's constantly growing. It's a plant, a dog, a cat, a person, whatever. The ocean is a good one because that's always moving and changing. And then you look at that, and then you look at like a solid object, like a giant rock on the beach, right? And you just kind of contemplate the differences. You contemplate it. You look at it. You just are kind of in the presence of it. It's a good exercise. And just so you know, in a lot of his stuff, he's not really giving practices. He's describing our past as human beings. In some of his writings, he described ancient humans as having these like ethereal, bendy bodies, but over time, our minds created these more rigid forms due to our loss of connection to our spiritual identity. That stuff is pretty interesting, actually. And something about it, again, really rings true. Even on an allegorical level, it just kind of rings true. I vibe with it. I don't know how else to say it. So anyway, back on track. So Steiner broke the human being down into multiple layers. You have the physical body. That's the part of us that we can touch, the biological machine that houses the deeper self. The etheric body. That is our life force or our prana or chi. And it keeps us alive and vital. It's deeply connected to habits, memories, and rhythms. You have the astral body. This is the seat of emotions, instincts, and dreams. When we sleep, our astral body is what travels, what dreams, what experiences the unseen realms. And then you have the ego, or the I consciousness, the thing that makes you, you. But Steiner said this isn't the final layer, right? Just the part of you that has the most awareness of this incarnation. And then you have the higher ego. It's a more evolved version of the self that has lived through multiple incarnations and is guiding the soul toward evolution. And finally, the Oversoul, or spirit self. This is the divine blueprint, the pure essence of our being that is connected directly to source. It's not just personal, it's cosmic. So according to Steiner, we don't just wake up one day and suddenly live in full awareness of these layers. It's a process of spiritual development that happens across multiple lifetimes. Meditation, study, and conscious inner work, it all kind of gradually aligns us with these higher aspects. So why does this matter? Well, if Steiner was right, then most of us are walking around completely unaware of the higher dimensions of ourselves. But if we can develop an awareness of these deeper layers, we start to experience reality differently, not just as a collection of random events, but as a highly organized, intentional system of spiritual growth. Again, a system that takes us home. This is an idea that permeates all of these systems. Now, let's talk about Edgar Cayce. This guy's story is pretty wild. He was born in 1877 in Kentucky. He grew up in a very free love kind of situation for the time, and his parents were actually witches. Just kidding. He was raised in a really devout Christian household and wanted to become a preacher when he grew up. That's usually the case, right? I mean, I'm telling you, Christians were spooky and fun back then. In fact, you can see where things got boring and stale. It was the 1970s. In the 50s, I think you could have seen it coming. But yeah, Christianity in America used to be pretty fucking wild. Y'all really need to read Mitch Horowitz's book, Occult America. It's so good. I can't recommend it enough. So Edgar's life took a hard turn when he discovered that he had the ability to enter deep trances and access some kind of higher intelligence. During his trance readings, he often referred to accessing a vast spiritual record containing all human experiences, which aligned with Theosophical Society's descriptions of the Akashic field or the Akashic record. He described it as a living archive of every soul's journey across time, which could be read for insight into past lives, karma, and the future. Now, Edgar's discovery of this ability to enter this trance was completely accidental. When he was a young man, he had a severe case of laryngitis that left him completely unable to speak for months. He tried everything to get rid of it, but nothing worked. So he finally tried hypnosis. Well, during a session, Cayce entered a very deep trance and was able to diagnose and prescribe a cure for his own condition. And even more shocking, wouldn't you know, when he followed the instructions that he gave while in a trance, his voice returned. So just like Robert Monroe, this led him to experiment further. Eventually, he realized that he could access this record while in this altered state. Trauma responses, anxiety, ruminating thinking, grief and loss, stress, these are all reoccurring patterns in the mind. They're often the result of reacting the same way over and over again. Why do we do this? Because the mind believes the past is still here, happening now, causing the nervous system to respond accordingly. What the mind perceives, the body feels. Mind Transformation and Restructuring, MTR, offers a pathway to release these patterns. It guides both the mind and the nervous system out of these repetitive cycles and into a lighter, freer way of being. If this resonates with you, feel free to reach out via direct message or through the contact section at theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. You don't have to live the way you've been living. Change is possible. He had access to everything from past lives to medical diagnoses to the nature of the soul. He just had access to it. So Cayce never wrote a book himself. However, a lot of folks have compiled his notes and things like that. There would actually be a stenographer present for a lot of these trances you'd go into. So it was all recorded that way. One that I read years and years ago was called Cayce on Reincarnation or something like that. Either way, there's a book I've always meant to read, which is the biography of Edgar Cayce titled There is a River. So check those out if you're interested. I think a lot of people think that or assume that I'm only interested in Hinduism and Buddhism since I reference them so much. Well, the reason for that is that both of these schools of thought have a really good way of breaking these ideas down. I mean, Steiner and Cayce are essentially saying the same things as Hinduism when it comes to the soul. But remember, Cayce and Steiner were not alive as long as Hinduism has been a system. So their ideas didn't get fully fleshed out. I mean, I'm sure they read other things and had influences, but if you take something like the Vajrayana Buddhism, it has been debated amongst its own followers for eons, constantly being set on fire and attacked sincerely from every direction by its followers. So a lot of the ideas and concepts that they've just been fleshed out more than, say, Steiner's or Cayce's. That being said, I don't know that they had mysticism completely figured out. However, the science of the mind, they definitely have that well figured out, in my opinion. I think that they were both onto something. Anyway, sorry for the digression. So when Edgar Cayce was in these trance states, completely unconscious, he would answer complex medical questions. He could recall people's past lives and describe spiritual stuff that he had no normal way of knowing it. And this wasn't some random parlor trick. Like, he gave over 14,000 readings in his lifetime. In fact, a lot of his predictions are still studied. Like, he was a fascinating guy. This is one of those moments that I mentioned earlier, and I'll use my own experience as an example. So my reading with Reverend Margaret Schmidt, she was right about all this stuff. She had absolutely no way of knowing it. Then saw things in Christy and I's life that later came true and made other predictions that haven't happened yet. So I look at it, and she was right about everything so far. But when she said things like I needed more iron or that I was dehydrated, I dismissed her like, you're crazy. Point being, if she was right about everything else, then why wouldn't she be right about iron and dehydration? It's like, man, I'm having trouble making this point, but it's like when we're confronted with truly anomalous experiences, there's a piece of us that shuts down. But that's part of this journey, learning to stay open to things without becoming lost. I think my nervousness around it is because they were both kind of clairvoyant, and I guess I have my own stuff around it. It's one of those things, I want it to be true, right? I want to know that that's possible. A lot of it's based on my own childhood experience. If I'm honest, I kind of feel like I need it to be real. And that's probably why meeting Reverend Margaret Schmidt and having that reading was so life-changing for me. I don't know. I just noticed that I'm starting to I'm getting sidetracked and I'm aspiring a little bit. And I think that's what it is. I think that, there was stuff as a kid that happened. And I just want to know it was real, right? And that, like I said earlier, it's a red flag, right? Like wanting it to be real. So I have to be skeptical, Tonight we saw something remarkable with two other people on a dock, and I just videotaped it. We got footage of it. I don't know what the fuck it was, but there's like, I have to kind of pull back, anyway, let's get back on track. I'm sorry. So, just like Steiner, Cayce described this kind of multi-dimensional soul structure. He said that we exist in three primary states at any given moment. And that is this is going to sound familiar, the conscious self, the part of us that thinks, worries, makes choices, the subconscious self, the deeper part of us that carries the memories of past lives, things like that, and this life, obviously. And then the higher self, the divine part of us that exists beyond time and space and is always connected to God. And this should sound very familiar if you've been listening to this podcast for any time at all. This is a structure that a lot of people at the time believed in. This is what Florence Scovel Shinn talked about, and in my opinion is a lot easier to digest, right? This is what we always talk about: the conscious mind, the subconscious mind, and the superconscious mind, or divine or higher self. And I kind of like this one better than Steiner's, right? I don't know why I have a weird block around Steiner, but I just do. I don't know. But I like him. The older I get, the more I like it. But I just think Edgar Cayce's is easier to understand, probably because it is close to what we already kind of feel and know about the mind. And maybe I'm just comfortable with it. I don't know. So Cayce saw the higher self as our true identity, a part of us that knows why we're here, what we came to learn, and what we need to do in order to evolve. So in context with what we've been talking about in a lot of our groups, in a lot of these episodes, we have a thought, right? Or a good idea, something we'd love to do. When we think of it, our body feels light and hopeful, but then it is followed up by a thought that is essentially a list of reasons why we can't, why it would be hard, and why we shouldn't even bother. So think about that in the context of what's being described here. The divine mind, right? The higher self gave you a good idea, the thing that is right for you and your journey here. But what happened? The conscious self or the conscious mind stepped in with the bullshit of the quote unquote real world to tell you, no, don't even try. Or it got you so spun up about what could happen that you never even tried it. And the saddest part of all of this, you believed that by listening to the conscious self, the conscious mind, rather than the higher self or the divine mind, that you were being sensible and realistic. You identified with your conscious mind. You identified with your scared small self and believed that those were your thoughts. You didn't identify with the divine mind. You identified with your conscious self, your conscious mind, your carnal mind, your scared small self. And know what's even sadder than all of that? That's what everybody does. And that's the mind they use to tell others or you not to even bother trying. And that fucking sucks. Remember this. One person's ability to do something is not a commentary on your inability to do it. Now, another idea of Cayce's is that our souls travel in groups. He said that people in our lives, our close friends, our family, even our enemies, are often souls we've encountered in past incarnations. These relationships are not random. They're karmic lessons playing out over lifetimes. And again, this isn't obviously an idea unique to Cayce. I know that the idea of having a karmic bond, or in Sanskrit, I think the word is Renanabanda, something like that. It's something that comes up in Hinduism and in Buddhism, obviously a different term. And if you wanted to be cynical, right, you could say, oh, well, he probably read that somewhere. He didn't learn it while he was in a trance reading the Akashic field. Well, let's remember, this stuff wasn't common knowledge or readily available to people at that time. This isn't a concept that comes up often in Buddhism or Hindu literature. Meaning he wouldn't have read it in something that was, people had back then, the Bhagavad Gita. However, it is an idea that comes up in the Abrahamic systems. But again, I don't know how common of an idea that even was at the time, being that Cayce was in Kentucky in the early 20th century. It wasn't an idea in Christianity that would have been discussed often or openly. And I don't know how much access he would have had to Kabbalistic or Islamic literature at the time. And I guess this is part of me building a case for him being clairvoyant. But, I don't know. I want it to be true. There you go. So just like Steiner and literally everyone else, Cayce believed that through meditation, prayer, self-inquiry, we can develop a clear connection to our higher self. And this would allow us to allow the higher self to guide us consciously rather than subconsciously. And this is what I'm talking about when I say that through meditation or meditative practice, we gain the ability to hear the divine mind more clearly, and more importantly, gain the ability to disregard the nervous system's urges towards the same old actions, as well as the conscious mind's same old fearful thinking. And that's how we transform our reality, by taking a new path. All right, now we get into the idea of the Daemon. Daemon means divinity or supernatural being of a nature between gods and humans. So the word Daemon is spelled Daemon, and it comes from the ancient Greek, and it does not mean demon. So don't think that. The Greeks saw the daemon as a spiritual guide, a kind of inner intelligence that whispered inspiration, insight, even warnings. Socrates, one of the greatest philosophers of all time, claimed that he had a daemon. He said that it was a voice that would tell him what not to do, a kind of inner knowing that prevented him from making poor choices. The poet Hesiod described daemons as spiritual guides that helped kind of guide humanity. I guess you could say spirit guides. And Plato talked about them as well, saying that every person had a daemon that exists between the realm of the gods and the human world, helping to steer this person towards a higher purpose, steering them toward a higher purpose. We could also hear this as the divine mind that we've been talking about here. Another fun paranormal kind of thing that's paranormal phenomenon that's kind of associated with the Daemon would be the third man effect. This is a phenomenon described by people that have been lost in, or they're in dire situations, they're going to die, where suddenly they were told where to go by a person that just kind of materialized and led them out. Or maybe if it wasn't, they couldn't see the person, it was a very clear, distinct voice. I know that something similar had been described by Joe McMoneagle as something that he experienced during war that actually saved his life. And just to remind you, he was psychic spy #1 for the CIA, and learn more about him in last week's episode. Now, this concept exists in other traditions as well. In Hinduism, there is the idea of the Anatarium. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't think I am. But it means like inner controller, which is a divine presence that resides within the soul, the body, the soul that constantly guides it towards spiritual awakening. So what if the Daemon is not separate from us, but actually our own higher self trying to break through? What if the Daemon is part of us that remembers, right? I mean, I think that it's clear that we exist in these layers, like several different minds, so to speak. And maybe when we are internally quiet and still, we learn to hear those voices. We learn to hear the divine mind. So now that we've broken down Steiner, Cayce, and the concept of the Daemon, let's zoom out and look at how different traditions describe the soul. Because when you do that, you start to see a pattern. This idea of a multi-layered self isn't just some Western esoteric belief. It's kind of everywhere. So in Hinduism, the soul is called Atman, of course, and isn't just your individual soul. It's actually one with Brahman, the universal divine consciousness. This is incredibly close to Steiner's idea of the Oversoul, the belief that the highest aspect of ourselves is not separate from the divine, but actually a fragment of it. In Hinduism, there is these different layers. There's the physical body, Annamaya Kosha. This is the biological form, like the meat suit. The energy body, Pranamaya Kosha. This controls life force and breath. The mental body, Manamaya Kosha, the realm of thoughts and emotions. The wisdom body, the Vijnanamaya Kosha, the intuitive higher understanding. And then finally, the bliss body, Anandamaya Kosha. That is the closest thing to pure divinity. So there is an overlap. These layers closely resemble Steiner's hierarchy of the self. Now, in Buddhism, there's a different take because there is no permanent soul in Buddhism. Instead, the self is a process, not a fixed thing. I think this is one of those semantic-y things between Hinduism and Buddhism. I mean, Buddha essentially taught what the Bhagavad Gita teaches. They just aren't talking, and Buddhists just aren't talking about Atmans and souls. They're saying things like mind stream. And instead of merging back in universal consciousness, it's the Dharmakaya. In Bhakti Yoga, right? The goal is to go back to Godhead, merge into the divine consciousness. So this also indicates that the soul, once the soul wakes up fully, it kind of dissolves or into source or rejoins God. So there's our golden thread. Now in Buddhism, there's anatta or non-self, which means that what we think of as quote unquote me is actually just a shifting collection of thoughts, memories, and energies. And you could argue that so is the soul. Like the soul is that same kind of thing, since the soul has a mind, subtle body, and all that. Now, here's the paradox. Buddhists talk about reincarnation, right? So what reincarnates? Well, karma and consciousness, your actions, thoughts, and experiences leave behind an imprint that carries forward into new lives. Or instead of an imprint, you could say a perception that results in new lives. So this is really similar to Edgar Cayce's idea of the soul evolving across lifetimes and Steiner's concept of a spiritual record that travels with us. So we're really seeing this golden thread thing that you can really follow it here. It's becoming very blatant, I hope. Now, let's look at Jewish mysticism. The Kabbalistic tradition says that the soul has three parts. Pardon my pronunciation. Nephesh, the lower instinctual soul tied to the body. The Rosh, Ruach, the emotional, moral soul responsible for personality. This one's a doozy. Neshama, the higher divine soul directly connected to God. I'm fucking these pronunciation. I can't even pronounce the word pronunciation. Take a breath, Welsh. Anyway, this mirrors both Steiner's breakdown of the different layers of human consciousness and Cayce's belief that the higher self is a direct connection to the divine. Now, finally, in Islam, the soul is called Ruh. R-U-H. And again, I'm probably mispronouncing this. Please don't fucking, yeah. Anyway, but it's believed that it is a direct gift from God, breathed into the body at conception. Now, there's also the concept of nafs, N-A-F-S, which is like the ego or the lower self. The goal of spiritual practice in Islam, whether through prayer, fasting, or Sufi mysticism, which I love, is to purify the nafs and align with the higher soul, the ruh. Again, this sounds a lot like what Steiner and Cayce are saying. This idea that part of our journey is to elevate, to kind of bring up the lower self to align with the divine. I like Cayce's better. I think that it fits with Florence Scovel Shin, and I also think that it fits best with my ideas. So I like Edgar Cayce. And fun fact, I was once told that by the first spirit medium that I ever saw, that I have a spirit guide that's been with me from the jump, and his name is Edgar. And that's why in the book, The Agreement, you see the name Edgar. I'd like to think it's Edgar Cayce. That's just my little... Anyway, so Christianity teaches that the soul is immortal and created by God. Which we all knew, but what I think is fascinating is the distinction between Eastern and Western Christianity. This is cool. In Eastern Orthodox Christianity, there's the idea of theosis, a divine union, where the goal of life is to gradually become one with God. This Eastern Christian idea is so interesting to me. We see all of these similarities between spiritual systems that are developed in the East as opposed to the way they unfold in the West, which I just think is so cool. Theosis, Eastern Orthodox Christianity. So fucking cool. Again, so this idea of theosis is very close to the idea of the Oversoul, right? That the higher self is not separate from God, but actually an expression of it. So across all these traditions, you see this repeating pattern of a lower self that is tied to the material world, a higher self that is divine in nature, and a process of growth that involves moving toward the higher self. So if everything we've talked about today is true, then who are you really? Are you just your thoughts, just your emotions, just the body? Or is there something, is there something bigger going on? I tend to think there's something bigger. If we really are these kind of multi-layered beings, if we have an oversoul and a higher self and the Daemon, then that means a few things. You're not just your thoughts and your emotions, right? Most of us live in the world of the mind and the ego. We identify with our worries and our fears and opinions. But if the higher self exists, then you are already much bigger than just these firing neurons. You are something ancient and powerful. You are divinely connected. You are part and parcel, as it says in the Bhagavad Gita. And 2, you have an inner guide, divine mind. Listen to it. If you've ever felt a strong gut feeling, an intuition, or a sense that something was trying to guide you, not scare you, right? Not scare you in a different direction, but guide you, right? That distinction is very important. Well, that might not just be random intuition. It might be your Daemon, your higher self, your oversoul, your divine mind, nudging you in the right direction. Remember, the Daemon, or the higher self, the divine mind, knows why you're here. It knows what you're supposed to be doing. So when you have those divine thoughts, those inspired thoughts that really charge you up, and you ignore them to go with the scared small self, that sucks, man. So try to pay attention to those feelings. And number 3, this whole path, right? The whole journey up the mountain is about aligning with a higher self, right? Every major tradition, Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they talk about elevating the lower self, right? Bringing it up to merge with the higher self, to maybe engage in the divine mind more so than the carnal or conscious mind, right? So meditation, prayer, journaling, these aren't just nice to have habits. They are literally tools for tuning into the divine intelligence within you. I love you. I love you. I love you. You have always held my hand, and now I'm holding yours. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If you enjoyed this content and would like to support its creation, visit theinfinitesparkofbeing.com. There you can explore the various ways to get involved and support this work. Click the About button, read a little bit about me, and see what I have to offer you through the one-on-one sessions. Don't forget to check out the Patreon tiers, where we're building a community of everyday people with not so everyday interests. You'll also find the online apparel store. And as always, head over to the Participate button and join us. Together, we're growing a community of spiritual seekers just like you.